My name is Arthur Brennan. I am 75 years old, and in this long life of mine I have learned that when people disappear from you one by one, when friends die and neighbors move away, when the house once filled with laughter becomes a place where only the ticking of the clock answers you, the only thing that can still hold you together is a creature that waits for you at the door every morning and lays its head on your knee when you sit down to rest. For me, that creature was Max, a shepherd mix with tired eyes and a graying muzzle who had shared the last 12 years of my life and, if I am honest, had saved me from falling into a pit of loneliness after my wife's death. When I buried Ellen, when the priest had said his final words and people slowly drifted back to their cars, it was Max who pressed his body against my leg and made me feel that I had at least one being left in this world who needed me. And since that day, he has been my morning, my evening, my excuse to step outside and breathe air that did not taste of grief. I live in a modest house on the outskirts of Lincoln, Nebraska, a house that Ellen and I bought 45 years ago when I was still working as a mail carrier, and she was teaching second grade at the local school. The neighborhood has changed. Most of the families we knew have gone, and new faces live behind the same doors. But the house itself has not changed much, except that now it looks too big for one man and too full of memories for one heart. The living room still has the chair where Ellen used to sit knitting while we watched television, and on the shelf above the fireplace the photograph of our wedding stands in a silver frame, the glass a little scratched, but the smiles untouched. I spend most of my mornings in that room, making myself coffee that never tastes quite right, and reading the newspaper even though the words blur more quickly than they used to, and Max always lies at my feet as though guarding me from slipping away entirely. He is old too, slower than before, sometimes limping when we return from our short walks. But the way his ears still rise when I say his name, the way he nudges my hand to demand a pat, makes me believe that we two old men, one human and one dog, are still useful to each other. People often tell me I should move into a retirement home where there are nurses and planned meals and cheerful activities. But I have never wanted that life, because such places rarely allow dogs, and I could not imagine mornings without Max's bark, or nights without his steady breathing beside my bed. To be truthful, I fear that if I ever let go of this house and of him, I will let go of myself too, and there would be nothing left but a body filling a chair. My daughter, Claire, has not shared that view for a long time. She visits rarely, sometimes once a month, sometimes only on holidays, and her voice on the phone always carries that brisk tone of someone who is already halfway into another conversation. She works in real estate and likes to talk about how busy she is, how clients demand too much, how houses are selling like hotcakes. But behind all that I often sense an impatience with me, as if I am a weight that she has to carry and cannot quite set down. When she was younger, we were close. I remember teaching her to ride a bike, watching her run to Ellen with scraped knees, laughing through tears. She was our only child, and for years she was the center of our little universe, but after Ellen died, something in her hardened, and though she never said it outright, I felt that she blamed me for the way her mother's last months were so full of hospitals and quiet desperation. She had wanted Ellen to try more aggressive treatments, but Ellen had refused, saying she wanted to go with dignity, and I supported her. That decision became a silent rift between Claire and me, one that time has not healed. Yet despite that distance, I still believed, foolishly perhaps, that family ties would always remain unbreakable. That belief is what kept me going through the silent dinners and the long evenings when only Max listened to my voice. I kept telling myself that even if she did not understand me, even if she judged me, she was still my daughter, still the child who once brought me dandelions from the yard and insisted I put them in a vase on the kitchen table. And so my life followed its rhythm, quiet and predictable, the rhythm of an old man who wakes up with the sun, feeds his dog, shuffles down the driveway to pick up the newspaper, and spends his days reading, tending a small vegetable patch, and talking to the only creature who never interrupts or disagrees. I thought it would go on that way until the end. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, one of those strangely quiet days when the neighborhood seemed to pause between the noises of lawnmowers and the chatter of children, that Claire arrived without calling first, her car pulling into my driveway with a sharpness that made Max bark and limp toward the door to greet her, his tail wagging with the loyalty that he offered everyone regardless of how they treated him. And I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel, still smelling of soap, from the dishes I had just finished, and opening the door with a smile that came more from surprise than from joy, because unannounced visits from my daughter were rare, almost unheard of in the last decade. She stood there in her business-like jacket, sunglasses perched on her head, though the day was overcast, and before she even greeted me, she bent down to pat Max, her manicured nails tapping his fur in a way that looked affectionate but felt strangely rehearsed, and then she rose quickly, scanning the hallway with eyes that seemed to be searching for flaws. "Dad," she said, her tone brisk, "we need to talk." Those words had been the beginning of many uneasy conversations in the past, usually about money or about my health. But this time, there was something colder in her voice, as if she had already decided on a course of action and was only here to inform me of it. She walked straight into the living room, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and I followed, feeling the unease build in my stomach. She looked around at the worn furniture, the carpet that had faded in the places where sunlight hit most strongly, the coffee table with rings from cups I had long ago stopped trying to polish out, and she shook her head slightly before turning to me. "This place," she said, "it's not good for you anymore, and look at Max." She pointed to him as he lay down with a sigh near my chair, his eyes following us with calm devotion. "He's old. He needs better care than you can give him. Dogs deserve exercise, proper food, maybe even a vet who sees them regularly. You can't even walk without your knees hurting. How are you supposed to take care of him?" I felt my throat tighten, because in those words was not concern, but accusation, as if she had rehearsed them in her mind until they sounded like a verdict. I tried to defend myself, telling her that Max still had his daily walks, shorter now but steady, that I cooked him rice and chicken when his stomach was upset, that the vet down the street still knew us by name. But she waved her hand impatiently, cutting me off. "Dad, you don't understand," she said. "This isn't about you trying your best. It's about what's fair for him. He deserves better than this dusty old house and an owner who can barely take care of himself." The words landed heavier than any blow could have, because in that moment she wasn't just judging me as a dog owner. She was judging me as a man, as a father, as someone whose time had passed. I stood there speechless, the towel still in my hands, while she crouched again to pat Max with exaggerated tenderness. Then, with a swiftness that stunned me, she clipped a leash onto his collar, the leash she must have brought with her because mine was hanging on its usual hook by the door, and said in a falsely cheerful voice, "Come on, boy, let's go. You're coming with me now." I stammered. "Wait, Claire, what do you mean?" But she didn't look at me, didn't answer with explanation or softness. She just said, "It's for his own good. You'll thank me later," and began to pull Max toward the door. He resisted at first, confused, looking back at me with ears lowered, but she tugged firmly, and slowly he followed, tail uncertain. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, blocking the door for a moment, begging her to stop, telling her she had no right. But she raised her chin and said sharply, "I have every right, Dad. I'm not going to stand by and watch an animal suffer just because you're too stubborn to admit you can't manage any more. If you love him, you'll let me give him a better life." She pushed past me, strong in her certainty, and I found myself frozen, torn between shouting and pleading, but unable to move quickly enough. Within minutes she was outside, opening the back door of her car, urging Max to climb in. He hesitated, turning his head toward me one last time, and the look in his eyes was something I will never forget, a mixture of confusion and loyalty and fear, as if he wanted me to command him to stay. I whispered his name, my voice breaking, but Claire's sharp tug on the leash forced him forward, and then the door closed behind him. I stumbled after her into the driveway, calling out, "Claire, please, don't do this. He's all I have left." But she had already slid into the driver's seat. She rolled down the window just enough to say, with a kind of cold finality, "He deserves better, Dad. You'll see, this is for the best." Then she started the engine and drove away, leaving me standing there with the wind ruffling the empty leash hook on the porch, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the railing to keep from falling. The sound of the car fading down the street was like a curtain closing on my last piece of companionship, and as I turned back to the house, the silence inside seemed louder than it had ever been before, every room echoing with absence, every corner stripped of comfort. I sank into Ellen's old chair and buried my face in my hands, feeling not only the loss of my dog, but the crushing realization that my daughter no longer saw me as capable of anything, not even love. The hours after Claire's car disappeared down the street blurred into a haze that I can scarcely recall except for the gnawing emptiness in the house, the absence of Max's slow padding across the floor, the silence where his sighs and occasional barks had filled the air, and as evening descended the room seemed to grow colder with every minute, as if the very walls were mourning with me. I walked in circles, finding myself at the window again and again, hoping irrationally that perhaps she might return, that it had been some grotesque misunderstanding. But of course the street remained still, only the occasional headlights sweeping across the darkened houses. When night came, I could not sleep. The bed felt like a tomb, the space beside me unoccupied, the shadows pressing in. I kept hearing the sound of the car door closing on him, the leash tugging him away from me, and I could almost feel the moment when his eyes met mine through the glass, that mute plea that I had failed to answer. At dawn I rose with an ache in my chest that felt heavier than my body could bear, and without even thinking I reached for the phone, dialing Claire's number with trembling fingers. It rang twice before she answered, her voice clipped, already impatient, as though she had been expecting my call. I asked her to bring Max back, told her I had not slept, that the house was unbearable without him, that he was my companion and not some burden to be redistributed like old furniture. But she interrupted with a sigh, the kind she used when I asked. Questions about her job she didn't want to answer. "Dad, listen," she said. "This is exactly why I had to take him. You're too attached. You can't see clearly anymore. He's better off here. I've already arranged for him to have proper food, and tomorrow he's going to the vet. Don't worry, I'll handle everything." Her tone was final, managerial, as though she were discussing a property listing rather than a living creature who had been the only anchor in my days. I tried to protest, my voice cracking as I told her that he would be anxious without me, that he would wait by the door for hours. But she cut me off again, sharper this time, telling me I needed to think about my own life instead of clinging to a dog. "You can't even mow your lawn anymore without help," she said. "You forget things, you're tired all the time, and now you expect me to believe you can keep up with a senior dog? Dad, you're fooling yourself. You need to start facing reality." The sting of those words was unbearable because beneath them lay an accusation I had feared for years, that I was slipping, that my independence was only an illusion, that my daughter saw me not as a man, but as a fading relic in denial. I wanted to shout that I was still in control, that my mind was clear, that my life was still mine. But the words caught in my throat, and all I managed was a broken whisper begging her to bring him home. She hung up without promising anything, leaving me staring at the silent receiver, my hands shaking so violently I could barely set it down. That day passed in a fog of humiliation and grief. Every sound in the house reminded me of what was gone, every routine broken. When I fixed myself a sandwich at noon, the sight of the empty bowl on the kitchen floor made my eyes blur with tears. When I walked down the driveway to collect the newspaper, my hand reached instinctively for the leash that was no longer there, and I stood frozen, staring at the hook by the door where it had hung for years, now bare and mocking. I tried to read, but the words dissolved on the page. I tried to nap, but the silence was too sharp. In the evening I called her again, unable to resist the ache, but this time she didn't answer. Instead she sent me a text message, cold in its brevity. "Max is fine. Don't worry. Focus on yourself." That night the emptiness turned to anger, a slow, burning fire in my chest. Who was she to decide what I could or could not manage? Who gave her the right to strip from me the one companion left in my life? As I paced the living room, fury mixing with despair, I realized that she was not simply acting out of misguided concern. There was calculation in her words, in her dismissal of my independence, in her hints about my supposed forgetfulness. She wanted me to doubt myself, to accept her authority, and I began to see the outlines of something darker, that this was not about the dog alone, but about control over me, over my life, perhaps even over what little I still owned. The next morning, determined to prove to myself that I was not the useless figure she imagined, I prepared a proper breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, coffee brewed strong the way Ellen used to like it, and I sat at the table as though reclaiming a small piece of order. But when I reached for the salt, my hand trembled, spilling a few grains onto the table, and immediately I thought of Claire's words, her insistence that I was declining, and doubt crept in like a shadow. I brushed it aside angrily, telling myself it was nothing more than nerves, yet the seed had been planted. By afternoon I could bear the silence no longer, and I walked to the park alone, the place where Max and I had taken our shorter strolls in recent months. Without him the park was strange, the benches empty, the grass too green, and I felt exposed, like a man pretending to live while missing half of himself. A neighbor saw me and asked where Max was, and when I explained, her face tightened in a way that told me she thought my daughter had been right. I hurried home, ashamed, though I had done nothing wrong. Days passed in this torment, each one eroding a little more of my sense of self, until I felt cornered in my own home, stripped of dignity and companionship, waiting like a schoolboy for permission from a stern parent. And each night, when the house settled into silence, I heard echoes of Claire's voice telling me I could not manage, that I was no longer capable, and the words lodged in my chest like stones. What began as grief over a lost dog was turning into something larger, a slow dismantling of my identity, and for the first time I wondered if this was her true intention all along, to reduce me until I had no choice but to surrender everything. It was nearly a week after Claire had taken Max when the truth of what she had done began to reveal itself to me, not through her words, because she had spoken very little since that Sunday, but through a chance encounter that cut deeper than any argument ever could. I was walking back from the grocery store, carrying a small bag with bread, milk, and coffee, when my neighbor, Mrs. Collins, stopped me on the sidewalk. She's a woman of sharp tongue and sharper eyes, the kind who misses nothing that happens on the block, and she asked in a voice that was both curious and pitying whether I had seen the photographs Claire had posted online. I told her I had no idea what she meant, and she pulled out her phone, tapping with quick fingers before showing me the screen. There, in bright color, was Max, my Max, sitting on Claire's polished hardwood floor, looking bewildered, a new collar around his neck and a caption written above in cheerful letters, "Rescued my poor old dog from neglect. Now he's safe and loved." The words struck me like a knife to the chest, because they were not only false but designed to humiliate, to paint me as some cruel or incapable man who had failed the only companion who had stood by me. As I scrolled through the comments, I saw friends and strangers praising her, calling her a hero, telling her how wonderful it was that she had saved him, some even suggesting that it was heartbreaking he had been left with someone so obviously unable to care for him. My vision blurred, and for a moment I could not breathe, because this was not just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate rewriting of my life, a public declaration that I was unfit, incompetent, less than human. I stumbled back to my house in a daze, dropped the groceries on the counter without unpacking them, and sat heavily in Ellen's chair, staring at the floor. For hours I could not move, my mind replaying the image of Max's eyes in those photos, wide and uncertain, not the eyes of a dog who had been rescued, but of one who was confused and displaced. I tried to understand how my daughter could twist love into accusation, how she could parade her betrayal as virtue, and the only answer that came to me was that this had never been about Max alone. He was the symbol, the excuse, the first piece in a larger plan to strip me of my autonomy. I thought back to the way she had spoken to me, the hints about my supposed forgetfulness, the comments about my knees and my lawn, the certainty with which she told me to face reality, and suddenly I saw it clearly. She intended to build a case, not in court perhaps at first, but in the court of public opinion, to show the world and then the authorities that her father was no longer capable of living alone, no longer able to manage even the simplest tasks, that he needed to be placed under her care, or worse, under guardianship that would give her access to everything I had worked for. The realization struck with such force that I rose abruptly, pacing the room, my hands trembling. I went to the desk in the corner, the one cluttered with old bills, bank statements, insurance papers, and I began rifling through them with urgency I had not felt in years. As the pile grew around me, I saw with sick clarity how many small things I had let slide, how many times I had signed documents Claire had placed in front of me without reading, trusting her as I once trusted her mother, how many checks I had, written to cover this or that expense she insisted was necessary. I saw the joint account we had opened years ago for her college tuition, still active, still draining a small monthly sum I had continued to deposit without thought. I saw her name on letters from the bank where she had offered to help me manage online access. I saw, in short, the threads of a net that had been tightening around me while I sat in my chair believing that my dog was enough to keep me safe. That night I could not eat, could not sleep, for every shadow in the room seemed to whisper of betrayal. I imagined Max lying on some unfamiliar bed in our house, hearing voices that meant nothing to him, waiting for me to appear, wondering why I had not come. The thought that he might believe I had abandoned him gnawed at me until my chest ached. Yet alongside the grief there grew a hard knot of determination. If this was her plan, if she truly meant to use him as evidence of my incapacity, then she had underestimated me. I might be old, my knees might ache, my nights might be long and silent, but my mind was still mine, and I would not surrender it. For the first time since Ellen died, I felt something like purpose ignite inside me, a fire that came not from hope but from outrage. She had taken my companion, she had shamed me publicly, and now she meant to take the rest of my life piece by piece. That night, staring into the dark, I swore to myself that I would not let her succeed, that somehow, against the tide of years and the weight of her cold ambition, I would take back what was mine. The morning after I discovered those photographs, I woke with a heaviness that seemed to press down on my chest more than the weight of age alone, and though I tried to shake it off with a strong cup of coffee and a slow walk around the kitchen, the truth was that something inside me had changed irreversibly, because once you have seen yourself turned into a caricature of incompetence in the eyes of others, you cannot return to the illusions that once allowed you to live quietly. The house, once merely empty, now seemed dangerous, as if its very walls had been used against me, because every chair, every plate, every shadow could be pointed to as evidence of neglect. I moved from room to room, noticing things I had never noticed before, a thin film of dust on the shelf above the fireplace, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, the sagging cushion on Ellen's chair, and in each of them I saw not simply the normal imperfections of an old man's home, but the potential ammunition, in my daughter's case, against me. My grief over Max remained sharp, but now it was joined by suspicion and fear, and I began to realize that if I did nothing, if I simply continued drifting through my days as I had, I might wake one morning to find strangers at my door with papers, declaring me unfit to manage my own life. That afternoon, determined to ground myself in facts rather than fear, I returned to the desk where I had left the stack of papers scattered, and I began methodically sorting through them, checking dates, signatures, balances, and names. The more I read, the colder I became, for patterns emerged that I had ignored before. There were automatic transfers from my account into the joint account I had once shared with Claire when she was at university, transfers that had continued for years after her graduation, amounts modest enough each month not to raise alarm, but significant when added over decades. There were utility bills that she had helped set up online, some of which routed through her email rather than mine, and I realized that in practice she had access to more of my financial life than I had. Worse still, there were documents with my signature scrawled at the bottom, agreements I had signed in moments of trust, telling myself that she was only making things easier for me. Looking at them now, I could barely remember what they had been for, and in that gap of memory I felt her shadow, the quiet calculation of someone who had been laying the groundwork for years. The shock of these discoveries mingled with rage, but also with something darker, shame. I had prided myself on being careful, on managing my affairs with the discipline of the years I had spent as a postal worker, where every address had to be precise, every delivery accounted for. Yet in my desire to believe the family meant loyalty, I had allowed myself to be careless with the very things that determined my freedom. And now, having taken my dog, having painted me as neglectful to her friends and colleagues, Claire had the means to go further. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. She would use Max as proof that I could not care for even a pet. She would use the joint accounts and bills as evidence that she had been supporting me. She would use my own signature on documents I barely recalled as proof that I had already begun to hand over responsibility. Each element, harmless on its own, became damning when arranged in the pattern she had created. I remember sitting back in the chair, the papers spread before me like the pieces of a puzzle whose picture I had never wanted to see, and realizing that I was not only under attack but already half conquered. Yet despair was quickly replaced by something sharper, the memory of Ellen's voice in our hardest times, telling me that dignity was not given but defended, that no one could take your worth unless you handed it over. I felt her presence then, as if she were standing just behind my shoulder, urging me to rise, to fight, not with fists or fury, but with patience and resolve. I gathered the papers into neat piles, placed them back into the desk, and decided that I needed help, not from family, but from those who understood law and money. The idea of speaking to a lawyer both frightened and shamed me. I had never been one to sue or argue formally, but now it seemed the only way to stop what was coming. That night, unable to sleep, I made a list of what I needed to do. First, I would visit the bank and close the joint account, ensuring that no further transfers could be made without my consent. Second, I would seek legal advice on the documents I had signed to learn exactly what authority, if any, I had already given away. Third, I would find out what steps Claire might take if she attempted to pursue guardianship, and what evidence I would need to defend myself. Writing these tasks on paper gave me a strange sense of strength, as if I had turned from prey to planner. Though the ache of missing Max gnawed at me, it was accompanied now by the fire of determination. The following day I went to the bank wearing my best jacket even though it was warm outside, because I wanted to present myself as orderly, respectable, not the feeble man Claire had painted. The clerk at the counter, a young woman with polite eyes, listened as I explained that I wished to close an account, and when she looked up the details and told me the balance, tens of thousands of dollars I had not even realized had accumulated there. Over the years I felt both sick and vindicated. That money, which had been siphoned quietly for so long, was still technically mine, and I signed the papers to move it into my personal account with a hand that no longer trembled. The young clerk asked whether I wished to keep my daughter's name on any of my accounts, and I answered firmly, "No, remove her from everything." As I walked out of the bank with the new papers in my pocket, I felt lighter than I had in months, as though I had reclaimed a piece of myself. But victories are never left unchallenged. That evening Claire called me for the first time in days, her voice bright and false at first, asking how I was feeling, but within minutes she moved to the real point. "I saw you went to the bank today," she said, her tone now edged with steel. "Why would you do that without telling me?" My heart pounded, realizing that she must still have ways of monitoring, perhaps through alerts or contacts within the branch. But I steadied my voice and told her that my finances were mine alone. There was silence on the line, then a laugh that chilled me. "Dad, you're making mistakes. You don't know what you're doing. People are going to see that, and when they do, you won't have the option of making these decisions anymore. They'll be made for you." It was not a threat shouted in anger, but a calm prediction, and it made my skin crawl. I hung up before she could say more, my hands shaking. Yet beneath the fear was resolve. If she wanted a war for my autonomy, she would have it. The next days I spent visiting a lawyer recommended by an old acquaintance, a man named Harris, whose office smelled of dust and leather. I laid out the papers I had signed, the joint accounts, the bills, and he examined them with a frown, tapping his pen against his notebook. "You haven't given away as much as you fear," he finally said. "These signatures grant her access, yes, but not ownership. The account you closed was within your rights. Removing her name from your finances was wise. But be prepared. If she attempts guardianship, she will try to present you as incapable, and the court will look at both evidence and medical testimony." I asked him what kind of evidence she might use, and he leaned back, studying me with sharp eyes. "She'll use anything she can, missed bills, unkempt property, even stories about your memory or your health. Has she tried to suggest you're forgetful? I nodded, and he sighed. Then it's clear. She's building a narrative. My advice is simple. Document everything, keep your house in order, and be prepared for medical evaluations. If your mind is sound, you have nothing to fear. I left his office with mixed emotions, relieved that I hadn't already lost everything, but haunted by the reality that my daughter was indeed preparing to strip me of control. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on me, yet there was also a strange exhilaration in knowing the battlefield, as if I had finally seen the contours of the enemy's plan. That night I cleaned the house with a vigor I had not felt in years, scrubbing floors, dusting shelves, organizing papers into neat folders, not because I cared about appearances for their own sake, but because I knew that any disorder could be twisted into evidence of incapacity. As I worked, I thought of Max, wondering whether he sensed my struggle, whether he still waited by her door for me, and I swore silently that one way or another I would bring him home. The escalation of events left me restless, every day a mixture of small victories and looming threats. Claire stopped answering my calls, choosing instead to send curt messages about how well Max was adjusting, each one accompanied by photographs that showed him on her deck, in her yard, beside her children, always with captions that suggested she had rescued him. I knew those images were designed not only for her friends, but for me, reminders that she controlled the narrative, that she had possession while I had only absence. Yet with every photo, my anger hardened into resolve, and I began to think not only of defending myself, but of reclaiming him, of finding a way to prove that he belonged with me, not as property, but as a companion, as family. It was during one of these restless nights, pacing the living room with the phone in my hand, that I realized the second escalation was not merely about her having taken Max or manipulated my finances. It was about the complete erasure of my authority, the slow rewriting of me into a figure who could be managed, sidelined, and eventually silenced. The true betrayal was not just the theft of my dog, but the theft of my identity as a father, as a man capable of love and responsibility. And with that realization came a quiet but unshakable vow. I would not allow her to finish the story she had begun. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when the sky was heavy with clouds that never released their rain, and the air itself seemed swollen with the weight of something about to give way, because it was that day I decided I could no longer wait passively for Claire's next move, no longer sit in my chair like an accused man awaiting judgment. I had spoken again with Harris, my lawyer, and he had advised patience, told me that as long as I kept my affairs in order, she would find no foothold for guardianship. Yet patience was a virtue I could no longer afford, because every day that Max remained away from me was another day of theft, another day in which she used him as a symbol of my supposed incapacity. That morning, while sorting through more of my papers, I discovered that one of my pension checks had been redirected electronically to the same joint account I had thought I had already closed, proof that Claire had tried to reactivate what I had ended, and the fury that rose in me was not only about money, but about the audacity, the sheer certainty she carried that her father was too weak, too tired, too beaten down to resist her. It was in that moment, staring at the evidence of her hand in my life yet again, that the decision formed clearly in me. I would take back not only my finances, but Max, and I would do it in a way that left no doubt to her, or to anyone else, that I was not the feeble caricature she had painted, but a man who still possessed will, memory, and power to act. I called Harris and told him to prepare the necessary papers to ensure my accounts were locked entirely under my name, and to draft a notice formally revoking any permissions I had ever granted Claire to act on my behalf. His tone was approving, but he reminded me that legal measures alone might not return my dog. That part, he said gently, was personal. And he was right, for the law could protect my bank balance, but not the bond of companionship stolen from me. So I turned to the one ally left to me, my neighbor Collins, who had shown me the photographs and who, despite her sharp tongue, had a sense of justice as strong as any I had known. When I confided in her that I intended to bring Max back, she nodded with a fierce look in her eyes and told me that she had already witnessed him tied for hours on Claire's deck while she was away at work, whining softly, ignored by those who claimed to have rescued him. That knowledge ignited me, for it proved what I had suspected all along, that Claire's gestures were not about love but performance, that Max was a prop in her theater of self-righteousness, and that without me he was not cherished but merely displayed. Together, Collins and I formed a plan that was both simple and terrifying. She would accompany me to Claire's house, not as a participant in any conflict, but as a witness, someone who could attest to my clarity of mind and to the conditions in which Max was kept. Harris had told me that as Max was legally mine, purchased and registered in my name years ago, I had every right to reclaim him, and though part of me feared confrontation, another part burned with the necessity of it. The following day we drove to Claire's neighborhood, my heart pounding with each block we passed, and when her house came into view my breath caught, for there he was, my old companion, tethered to the railing of the deck, his head resting on his. Pause, his eyes lifting as though he sensed me even before he saw me. The moment our eyes met across the distance, his body jerked up with sudden life, tail thumping, ears forward, and the sound of his bark, raw, urgent, joyous, nearly brought me to my knees. Claire was not home, but her car was in the driveway, and Collins urged me forward, reminding me of my rights, reminding me that sometimes justice is not given, but taken. My hands shook as I unlatched the gate, walked across the yard, and knelt beside Max. His fur smelled faintly of the outdoors, his body thinner than before, and as I unclipped the rope from the railing, he pressed his head into my chest with a whimper that seemed to carry all the confusion and longing of the weeks apart. Tears blurred my vision, but my voice was steady as I whispered, "I'm here, boy, I'm here." With Collins watching, I led him back to the car, opened the door, and he leapt in with the energy of years past, curling into the seat as though no time had passed at all. We drove away before Claire returned, and for the first time since Ellen's death I felt not only relief but triumph, the surge of victory that comes when something that was wrongly taken has been restored. Of course the matter did not end there. That evening Claire stormed into my house without knocking, her face flushed with fury, demanding to know how I dared steal her dog. Her words spilled out in a torrent of accusation, neglect, irresponsibility, senility, and behind every word was the unmistakable intent to frighten me into surrender. But I did not retreat. I stood before her with Max at my side, his body pressed close to mine, and I told her in a voice as calm as the anger burning beneath it that Max had never been hers, that he was registered in my name, that I had cared for him every day of his life, and that if she wished to challenge me, she could do so in court where her lies would wither under the weight of evidence. Collins, who had accompanied me into the house for this very purpose, stood silently in the corner, a living witness to my clarity and my resolve. Claire faltered then, her tirade breaking against the wall of my composure, and though she tried to recover with threats of legal action, her voice had lost its conviction. The climax of our confrontation came when I placed the freshly signed legal documents Harris had prepared on the table between us. I told her plainly that she no longer had access to any of my finances, that every account was closed to her, that any attempt to interfere again would be met with legal consequences. She stared at the papers as if they were a betrayal greater than anything she had accused me of, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were full, not of righteous indignation, but of naked rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice shaking. But even as she said it, she stepped back, retreating toward the door, because she knew the balance had shifted. I was no longer the passive old man she had hoped to control. I was a father reclaiming what was his. When the door slammed behind her and silence returned to the house, I sank into Ellen's chair with Max at my feet, his head resting against my leg as if to seal the bond anew. My chest heaved with exhaustion, but beneath the fatigue was a fierce, unshakable certainty. I had stood my ground, I had acted when everything in me wanted to collapse, and I had proven, to her, to myself, and perhaps even to the ghosts of those who once doubted me, that I was still here, still capable, still master of my own life. The storm outside finally broke then, rain tapping against the windows, and as I stroked Max's fur, I felt the rhythm of it echo the beating of my heart, steady, strong, unbroken. In the days that followed that stormy night, the house seemed to breathe again, as though walls that had been holding their breath for weeks finally exhaled and allowed warmth to return. And I realized that the true weight of loneliness had not been the silence of empty rooms, but the silence of injustice, the sense that my life was being written by someone else without my consent. With Max back at my side, the routines of my days regained their rhythm, each morning walk, each meal shared, each quiet evening in Ellen's chair becoming an affirmation that I had defended something sacred. He followed me from room to room as if unwilling to let me out of his sight, his old eyes softer now, his body pressing close whenever I sat down. And I knew he had suffered too, confused by displacement, relieved to return to the place that was his. As much as mine. The small garden behind the house seemed brighter when I stepped into it with him at my heels, and even the simple act of clipping vegetables for supper felt like victory because it was done on my own terms, not under the shadow of someone else's judgment. Claire did not return after that night. There were no more calls, no more photographs, no more attempts to pry into my accounts, and though part of me ached with the knowledge that my daughter had chosen estrangement over reconciliation, another part accepted it as the price of truth. A man cannot live forever in illusions, and for too long I had clung to the image of her as the little girl who once brought me dandelions and begged me to keep them in a vase. That child had vanished long ago, replaced by a woman hardened by ambition, and though I could mourn what was lost, I could not allow myself to be destroyed by what remained. My lawyer assured me that the documents now left no loopholes for her to exploit, and Mrs. Collins, ever watchful, told me that the neighborhood had quietly taken note of who I was and how I lived, countering the false image Claire had painted online. In small ways, I began to feel vindicated, not because others approved of me, but because I had reclaimed the right to define myself. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and violet across the horizon, I sat on the porch with Max at my feet, listening to the cicadas hum in the grass, and I thought of Ellen. I wondered what she would have said about all this, whether she would have urged me to forgive Claire or to stand firm. And in my heart I heard her gentle voice telling me that love must be offered freely, but never at the expense of dignity. It was then I understood that forgiveness was not the same as surrender, that I could wish my daughter well from afar without allowing her to trample the life I had built. The bitterness that had once consumed me softened into something quieter, a sober acceptance that some bonds fray beyond repair, but that life, even in its final chapters, can still hold meaning if one refuses to let others write the ending. Now, when I wake in the morning, I no longer dread the silence. Instead, I listen for Max's steady breathing, feel his weight against my bed, and rise with a sense of purpose. Each walk, though slow, becomes a declaration that I am still here, still moving forward. Each meal I cook, however simple, tastes of independence. Each evening I spend in the chair that once belonged to Ellen feels less like an echo of grief and more like a vigil of memory, a way of honoring the woman who taught me that even in the face of betrayal, a man can remain true to himself. And as I stroke Max's fur and watch the shadows lengthen across the walls, I know that while family can fail you, while blood can turn against you, the measure of a man's worth is not in the inheritance he leaves behind or the approval of his children, but in the quiet strength with which he guards the small corner of the world entrusted to him. I will not pretend there is no sorrow, for losing the closeness of a daughter is a wound that will never fully heal, but I have chosen not to let that wound define me. Instead, I live in the knowledge that I defended what mattered, that I did not let myself be erased, and that in the end justice was not delivered by some distant authority, but won here, in this old house, by a man and his dog who refused to be parted. And when my time does come, whether soon or many years from now, I will leave this world knowing that I did not go quietly into the role of the helpless old man, that I fought for my dignity, and that for however long I remained myself.